Go ahead and be turning to the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation. We'll be continuing our study there. Really still working to introduce it, as there's still some things we need to go through by way of introduction before we get into chapter 1 itself. Some sort of keys and things to help us in our study of the book. Before we get though into the new part of the introduction in terms of what we've gone over, I want to just quickly review through some of the early stuff that we went through Wednesday that is very important for us in our study of the book of Revelation. The first thing that we talked about on Wednesday that's very important is the question of, can we understand the book of Revelation? We said the book of Revelation is a book that is often avoided because it can be and is rather difficult. You open up some Bible, you read Ephesians, and you can read it beginning to end, and you may have a passage here or there that may be more difficult, but that's pretty simple to understand just by reading it through a couple of times. You can read and reread and reread Revelation, and until you understand some keys that we're going to get to later, it's difficult to understand. Well, because of that, it's a common thing that when we get into Revelation, we can grow frustrated and just give up a study of the book. And so we want to understand that despite the fact that it is difficult, and despite the fact that we can grow frustrated at times in studying, and that there are these difficult sections, that there's no need for us to grow frustrated. Yes, it is difficult, but we can understand it. Now, as we said, there are going to be some specifics we're going to get to throughout our study. Just as an example, we'll get later on into the book of Revelation. We're going to get into, in chapter 6, about a white horse, red horse, a black horse, and a pale horse. And you just read through. The pale horse is easy to figure out what it represents, but some of the others are key. What exactly does this mean? There are really two possibilities that are commonly given. A few, but really two main ones given, and both could fit the text. And so we can't be dogmatic in studying things like that. Well, it is this is definitely what it is, or it's definitely this. And we can get some evidence that says, I think this is what it is, and here's the evidence for that. But we can't be dogmatic. But you know what we can understand? Even if we're struggling with, okay, is the white horse representing victory over Rome, or is the white horse representing the victory in the gospel, which is really what your common ideas are? At the end of the day, you know what the point of that chapter is, especially as you get into the 5th and 6th seal? That ultimately God's going to be victorious, and that Rome will fall. So we can't be dogmatic about specifics, but we can get the point that's being made, and we can understand and apply the book. We also talked about the title of the book, Revelation. It is in the first verse, it talks about the revelation. The apocalypsis is the word there, or word apocalypse. It means a laying bare or a making naked, Thayer said. Ray Summers, in his commentary, Worthy is the Lamb, said the purpose of the writer was not to cover up his message, but to make it increasingly vivid by unveiling through signs and symbols. And so we said it's not that John's trying to hide the message, because we can understand it. Even the very definition of this word apocalypsis, this laying bare, making naked, gives the suggestion that we can understand it. But what he's doing is writing through signs and symbols so the people of that day, undergoing this persecution, could understand it without the enemy necessarily understanding the message that was being preached. And we gave some illustration of that on Wednesday. We talked about the author, and we'll go through this rather quickly. He identifies himself as John in verse 1 of chapter 1, chapter 4, verse 9, chapter 22, 8, and just a few times throughout the book he mentions that the writer is John. Some suggest that perhaps this John is not the Apostle John, but some other John. But as we said, evidence supports the fact that this John is the Apostle. A Justin martyr who was killed in 166 AD and was from the area of Asia Minor, which, remember, Asia Minor is where this book was sent to, said the book was by John the Apostle. Irenaeus, the pupil of Polycarp, who was a bishop of the church in Smyrna, also attributed it to the Apostle John. As for the dating of the book, we said this is not the biggest controversy overall. There are bigger controversies concerning the book and some teachings that come out of it. But in terms of what the question is among brethren, for the most part, in the conservative Bible students, is what's the dating of the book? And there are really two dates given. There's the range from about 54 to 68, and then about 95 or 96. We talked about some arguments or evidence for the early date. The arguments are primarily internal. And those arguments are this. It's argued because Revelation 17, 9 through 11, that there about the kings, and it represents 7 kings, and 5 have been, and 1 is, and 1 is yet to come, and Nero's the 6th emperor. And so that's the argument, and so it must be in the time of Nero. Well, there's still some debate as to who really counts as an emperor, and so depending on where you're looking in history, some would say, well, this is the 6th emperor, and others will say, no, this is. Because there were some that technically, though they may not have really been an emperor or have the title of Caesar. So there's some debate about that. And again, we're in a symbolic book, so we don't necessarily have to take the 6th as being that there's literally been 5 that have already ruled, and we're literally on the 6th one. Because if that's the case, then there's literally 1 to come. But as we'll get to in a minute, that word about what 7 means, I think it's presenting a picture for us. And we'll talk about those when we get into some of those later chapters. It's also argued that in chapter 11, verse 1, John is told to measure the temple. And so it must be before 70, because in 70, when Jerusalem was destroyed, the temple was destroyed along with it. Now, as we mentioned, we need to remember this. What John is seeing is a vision. What can happen in a vision? Anything. Okay, we've got the temple still standing. Doesn't mean it's actually standing. He also saw some commanders that looked like frogs. There was also a dragon. There was also this harlot that was sitting on this beast with all these horns. There's just such a vivid picture here in symbolic language that it doesn't mean that he's talking about the actual temple and its physical location. I think evidence suggests, as we went through Wednesday, that this has been 25 or so years since the temple has been destroyed. Just because it's mentioned doesn't mean it's physically standing. The third one is that Nero's name, correctly spelled, which is Neron, Caesar, would compare to the number 666. And as we mentioned, that involves Art Ogden argued in his commentary, in which Ogden takes the early date, that according to many prominent authorities, the number of the beast, 1318, identifies Nero Caesar. The name is recognized by Bible scholars as fitting the demands of the passage more than any other. The numerical value of the letters in his name totals the identifying number. The number is 666, and Neron Caesar, his name correctly spelled, computes to the magic number. So the argument, as we said, is not really as simple as that. In order to get from Nero, the name Nero, to 666, you translate to Hebrew script. You translate from Greek to Hebrew, and then you translate that from the Hebrew language script to the Hebrew gematria to convert it to numbers to get a 666. And so there's a lot of we got to do this, and then we get to the name. It's also pointed out by another commentator that it's doubtful John would have referred to Hebrew numbers when writing in the Greek language to a Greek audience, as it is questionable whether these Asian Christians would have been able to translate the Hebrew. They may, so we don't even know for sure that these Christians even really knew Hebrew to translate it. And again, we're dealing with symbolic language. It's Haley that suggests this on page 298 of his book in dealing with that chapter, that it seems more symbolic, 6 being short of the number for perfection or completion, which is 7. 6 falls short of that. The Jews sort of viewed 6 like people today view 13. It meant doom and dread. And so it seems more that what he's saying is it's evil or doom upon doom upon doom. It's not used I don't think it's used referring to a specific person. And again, we'll have to get on all that when we get to those chapters later on. But right now, we're just sort of trying to get an overview as the arguments for the date. But I don't think it's referring to a specific person. And so when we get there, we'll talk more about it. But again, the argument is if you translate to the Hebrew script and to the Hebrew gematria, that's how you get from Nero to 666. That's really the 3 of the main arguments concerning the early date. As for the late date, there's a number of evidence. There's both external and internal. So we said all the arguments for an early date are internal, which we said is good. We want internal evidence, what the Bible has to say, but we have internal evidence to argue for the early or for the late date as well. But there's also some external evidence, and that is Irenaeus. We mentioned him earlier. Irenaeus was a pupil of Polycarp. Polycarp was born in about 69. Polycarp served as a bishop in Samaria, or in Smyrna. Smyrna was one of the 7 churches. So Irenaeus learned from Polycarp, who was in Smyrna around this time, and Irenaeus said it was written during the reign of Domitian. So there's some external evidence there, but remember, we've got Polycarp, who may have been there at the time the letter was received, or at least was closely associated with those that knew John, who then influenced Irenaeus, and Irenaeus in his recording said it was written in the 90s during Domitian's reign. Eusebius also quoted Tertullian concerning Domitian's practice of expelling his enemies. We mentioned this at the end on Wednesday. Domitian and Nero, the difference in them, Nero accepted emperor worship. Domitian required emperor worship. Now, you can worship whoever you wanted besides Nero, but as long as once a year you came and worshiping Nero, that was fine. But if you didn't, then he expelled you from the kingdom. Well, for the guy over here that's worshiping, the Greek god of Zeus, or the Roman god, or the one over here that's worshiping his idol, there's no problem once a year to come and bow down to Domitian because I'm staying on his good side. But for those that are servants of Christ, that's a matter of religious compromise, and they would not do so. As for the internal evidence, there are a number of pieces we gave. First of all, why write about the destruction of Jerusalem to people in Asia Minor? They're quite a bit removed from that situation. Furthermore, Jews would not have had the authority to banish John to Patmos, and yet he's in Patmos, according to chapter 1, verse 9. It's also unlikely the 7 churches changed this drastic in a decade. Now, obviously, there has to be a little bit of, for certain of these things, there has to be a little bit of conjecture on our part. Like arguing, okay, the temple had to be standing, or arguing that the churches couldn't deteriorate. Ogden would argue that churches could easily deteriorate in that short time frame, and it's true. But when you have these churches who have deteriorated, particularly Laodicea and Ephesus, who we know from the letter to the Ephesians and those at Laodicea being mentioned in other letters, were strong churches, and how far they've come at this point, it seems the likelier scenario was that happened over a long period of time, not something that happened over a short period of time. Furthermore, it is unlikely Laodicea rebuilt itself so fast after an earthquake in 60. In 60 AD, there was an earthquake that pretty much totally leveled the city. And that should be chapter 3, verse 17, where he's talking to those at Laodicea, that they're rich, and basically talking about how they said, you're saying you're rich and you need no help. That's because they refused help from Rome when the government was going to come in and say, we're going to help you rebuild the city. Laodicea said, we can do it ourselves. And as we said, to their credit, they did. But while they sat back thinking they're so rich, look what we did, suggesting the idea that the city has already been brought to completion. You proved your point. To Rome, they were actually spiritually poor and weak. We also talked about the persecution for refusing emperor worship, chapter 13:7 and 11-18. That happened under Domitian. Again, Nero accepted emperor worship. If you came and said, I want to bow down and worship you, Nero wasn't going to say, no, don't do that. But Domitian required it. And what we read in Revelation suggests that emperor worship was not just accepted, but was pushed. And if you didn't worship, then there were consequences to pay. The book is also heavy in Jewish symbols and Old Testament symbols, which we'll get to a little bit later in our rules for study. That's something the Jewish persecutors would have understood. If this is prior to 70, the Jews are the main persecutors of the church. Around 64-ish, that started to change when Nero picked up, from about 64 to his death in 68. And so it picked up some Rome then, but the Jews would have been the main persecutors. Well, who would have known Jewish symbols? Other Jews would have. But you know who wouldn't have? The Roman government and the Roman Empire. Let's go to methods of interpretation now. That's all, trying to review some of that, because again, the date in particular has a major impact on everything we do from here on out because of one of these methods we're going to talk about that we use. There are 5 main methods that are really talked about concerning interpretation. Interpretation of the book. They're in your workbook. I've got them listed here. There's more detail provided in your workbook. If you have Summers' commentary, Worthy is the Lamb, he argues these out as well. Here are the five. Number one, the futurist interpretation. The futurist interpretation views the book as dealing with events at the end of the world. So that it's not talking about Rome, or if somebody takes the early date, it's not talking about Jerusalem falling. That what it's got under consideration is the end of time. Well, we only have to go about 10% of the book to take care of that one. The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave to him to show his servants things which must shortly take place. Whatever's under consideration was not something way off in the future. It was something shortly take place. You know what shortly took place within the next few hundred years was the fall of Rome. We're still now nearly 2,000 years. If this again, going by 90, the closest to now and the date we're taking, we're still what? 1,935 or so, or 30 years from when the book was written. That's not really a short period of time, but the fall of Rome was. The second one is called the continuous historical interpretation. So basically what that is it sort of views the book as a forecast of the church's history from John's day into the end of time. So what's under consideration is not a specific event. It's not a specific downfall of a nation. That it's sort of, this continuous historical interpretation says, you know what? It was for those people about, what it really says is for those people it was dealing with Rome. Why? Because Rome was the persecutor. But you know what? If we start getting to a day and a time where our society is being persecuted by the government here, then it's really talking about the fact that we'd be suffering. And then if the earth continues to stand and some nation rises to power and it's persecuting God's people, then it's talking about that. That's the viewpoint, that it sort of changes throughout history. And so it's sort of a forecast. It's not about one specific. The third is the philosophy of history interpretation. Summers, on page 41 of his commentary, defined it this way. It looks upon the book as containing a discussion of the forces which underlies events, but not a discussion of the events themselves. So, and I'm going to get to our interpretation in a minute. It's the fifth, historical background. But how we would define it is, this book is specifically talking about the downfall of Rome. Now, are there lessons we learn from that and can apply today? Absolutely. The way that the philosophy of history interpretation has it is it's not about a specific event. It's about the sort of underlying forces behind that event, which can also be the underlying forces to another event later on. So again, the continuous historical interpretation, the difference between them, basically says it's just sort of a running forecast that shows you this is going to happen, and then it's going to happen again, and then it's going to happen again, and then it's going to happen again, which, by the way, I think chapter 20 would suggest is not going to happen. It happened, Satan was bound, he was limited, and then there's going to come a time that at some point it seems he's loosed, and then he's going to take one last sort of effort at Christ, and then there's going to be the end of time. It's not something that's just going to happen and happen and happen and happen again. The philosophy of history interpretation isn't about it happening again and again, but basically it's just about the underlying forces, Satan and what's at his disposal. And it's not about Rome or it's not about Jerusalem, but it's about the forces that he sort of uses that underlie and cause the problems. The fourth is called the preterist interpretation. Now, in here, when we get to that in this next one, they're similar in this regard. Preterist basically says large part of what he is talking about has taken place. It sees the book as written for the people of John's day. We all will agree with that. It was written for the people of John's day. There's lessons we can learn, but it was written for them about their situation and largely fulfilled in that period. Well, that's true too. Shortly thereafter, when Rome fell, it was filled, and what he's talking about was filled in that period. Most of it. Now, we do have the final judgment at the end of the book and being in heaven, but that it's largely fulfilled. Some preterists hold to AD 70 doctrine. Not all preterists hold AD 70 doctrine, but if you hold the AD 70 doctrine, you have to be a preterist. AD 70 doctrine basically says Christ returned in 70 AD when Jerusalem was destroyed, and there is no final judgment. This is the end time. There's no resurrection. That's a very quick summary, but that's really what they're saying. They would take the preterist approach. Now, again, there are others that take the preterist approach or interpretation that aren't necessarily AD 70. But that's just an example of one that everything was largely fulfilled in that time frame, and then it doesn't have any real value to us today. We're using, and I think it's the only one that really fits the book, what is called the historical background interpretation. I like the summary that Ray Summers gives in his book on page 50. The historical background advocates see in Revelation a book written for the people of that day. We said we all agree that's true. Set in a definite historical background and fulfilled in the events of the first 2 or 3 centuries. So, we'll all agree with that. He's talking about writing to people in that day and time about their specific situation and about events that are going to shortly take place. In the next 2 or 3 centuries, it took place. Here's the difference between that and the preterist interpretation. These advocates differ from some preterists in that they see in this background and series of historical events and conflict a very definite message for all time. So a preterist would basically say the book was for the people of that day. There's not really anything that we're going to take from it. Today, what we're saying is it was written for the people of that time about their specific situation, but there are so many lessons from this book that we can take and apply to us today. That's the main difference in those two. So we're using the historical background interpretation. We interpret the events based off the historical context about the downfall of Rome. Again, if you take the early date, downfall of Jerusalem. But we're going by 90 AD, the downfall of Rome, and it's about those events, but there are practical lessons we can learn today. Yes?
Romans 15:4 is the things written for, written for our learning, so that we, through patience, come to the Scripture, might have hope. I mean, in a way, that's the way we look at Revelation now. Those things written about those 7 churches, the consequences of not repenting, things like that, they were written in a sense for their learning. But as we look at today, the difference being the old law was nailed to the cross, these things would still fall under the new law. But there's a certain principle along those lines that even those things happen there. The things that they were told to do in light of this persecution still applies to us today.
You're right. And I think as we go through here a minute, the purpose of the book, and I've said it, I hope when we finish, we learn a lot about Revelation by the time we come to the end. But if you only remember 2 things, remember the main theme, because everything ties back to these 2 points we're fixing to talk about. So, is the first beast the Roman emperor, or is the first beast the Roman Empire? And there's this debate here. Well, you know what the point at the end is? That beast is going to be overthrown, right? Whether it's the empire or it's the emperor himself, he's going to be taken care of. So, and again, when we'll get to the rules in a minute, we don't want to get bogged down in the details to the point that we miss the main theme. So what's the purpose or main idea behind the book? Well, first and foremost, it's to encourage the first century Christians undergoing persecution. So again, there's specifics for their time. Now, there's lessons we learn from that for us today, but specifically to them in that day and time, encourage them undergoing persecution and show them that Rome would not stand forever. Remember, you've got the vision, you've got the the fifth seal when it's opened up, and you've got the souls crying under the altar about how long. It sort of felt like, if you look at it from the human standpoint, it felt like Rome was winning, and like they might actually be effective because people were denying Christ and turning from Him. They might stamp this out, and this is encouragement. Don't give up, because ultimately they're going to be overthrown, and Christ's going to be victorious. So again, remind the audience that God is on His throne. If you remember two things, I've said this already a few times. If you remember 2 things, remember this. And don't think that this means we can only try to remember 2 things. But these are the 2 important things to remember that everything else ties back to. God is on His throne and in control. Chapter 4. That's when we get to chapter 4, we're going to go through who are these 4 beasts here and who are the 24 elders. The main theme of the book, and again, we'll get into those specifics, but the main purpose of that chapter is to show us that guess who's still in control? It's God. He's on His throne. And the Lamb is going to be, or Christ is going to be, victorious, and then encourage them to maintain their loyalty to Christ. So, what's the message of the book? So again, we've talked about this before. The purpose is, this is why I'm writing. The message is sort of fulfilling that purpose. And so the message we give, and just a side note, I told somebody this the other day. The theme on the front of your workbook is different. It's not different, it's the same message. And the wording is different the way I have it. That's the way it's worded in your book when I put the cover. This is the way I'll have it worded, but the same point. There's victory in the Lamb, or victory in Christ. And so the key verse is chapter 17, verse 14. These will make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them. For He is Lord of lords and King of kings, and those who are with Him are called, chosen, and faithful. Every chapter we go to, with the exception of chapters 2 and 3, and in that case we'll give a key verse for every church, summarizing every church. But like we do in our other studies recently, every chapter we go to, I'm going to say, here's the key verse. Well, there's also a key verse as we do to the books. There's a key verse to the book. And I would encourage you, if you highlight in your Bible, if you write in it, go to chapter 17, verse 14. Write a star there, highlight it, whatever you do, you may write the words key verse. This summarizes the main theme of the book, that Christ is going to be victorious. Now, where we want to spend most of our time left, and then we'll get to some rules as we have time left this morning, is on some of the numbers of Revelation. When you get into Revelation, there are just so many numbers. Whether we talk about there's 7 churches, and then there's 7. He talks about the 7 spirits in chapter 1, and then you've got the number 10 occurs several times, and the number 1,000, and the number 4, and the number 3. There's a lot of numbers, okay? And so when we go through there, we need to understand the symbolism. It's not just one, right? When we get to some of these examples, it's not that the numbers to be taken literally. Again, I think like with the chapter 17, when it talks about the 7 kings, 5 have been, 1 is yet to come. I don't think he's literally saying that we're on the 6th king. He's using it in symbolism. 6 have risen to power. There's a 7th, or that is, there's more yet to come. 7 being a complete number, and we'll get to that in a minute. So we need to understand, and this is in your workbook, that you want to keep these in mind, what these numbers mean. So when we get to them, I know this is the symbolism meant by that number. So let's go through some of those real quick. Number 1, it suggests unity or oneness. That one's pretty simple, but there's an idea of unity when there's 1. 2 suggests strength, energy, or redouble courage. When you get to the chapter on witnesses, how many witnesses are there? 2. There's 2 witnesses, right? And so the number 2 suggests strength, energy, or redoubling courage. Number 3. Haley says of number 3, consider its use throughout Scripture. 3 appears to have been symbolic of a complete and ordered whole. It is considered and sometimes referred to as the divine number. Why? Because there's the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, 3 in 1. So it's referred to as the divine number by some commentators. It suggests a complete and ordered whole. The number 4 suggests the world in which men live, we work, and die. So when you see the number 4, it's often suggesting the world. So, I know we're going out of order on our numbers, but 3 and 4, 3 plus 4 is 7. 7 is a combination of the world number, 4, and the divine number, 3, which means completeness, plus the world number, expressed perfection or a wholeness. We take the divine number and the earthly number, and we put them together, we have 7, and perfection or wholeness. So just as an example, how many churches are being written to? 7 churches. Now, there are 7 literal churches that he's writing to. He mentions them by name. Does that mean there wasn't an eighth church in that region that couldn't use the book of Revelation? No, but I think 7, and not just that it went to 7, but there's a perfection or a wholeness. 7 represents the whole. Number 6. 6 represents failure. Why? If 7 is perfection, 6 falls short of perfection. It was for the Jews what 13 is for many today, an evil number, as we said. Summers pointed out on page 24. The number 12, or the number 10 rather, is another number meaning fullness or completeness. The number 12, it represents God's people. Why? There were 12 patriarchs of Israel, right? The 12 sons of Jacob. There were 12 tribes. There were 12 apostles. So the number 12 represents God's people, or some division of that. I think when we get to chapter 4, there's 24 elders. I think it represents all of God's people under the old and all of God's people under the new. There's 12 and 12, right? We get the whole picture. The number 1,000, it's the result of multiplying the complete number. 10 times 10 times 10. It symbolizes a complete or full period of time. 1,000 is used to represent time, and it's not to be taken literally. right? It's a symbolic book, but it represents a full or complete period of time. Now again, we'll get more into that when we get to the 1,000 years in this question about chapter 20, but it's just a full period of time. 144,000, right? The number we often hear of about the saved. What does it represent? Well, 10 times 10 times 10, our number for a complete or full, right? A full period of time. It's our number, it's our complete number, 10 times itself, plus our number for God's people, 12 times itself added together. So this complete number, 10 times 10 times 10, or 1,000, plus 12 times 12, the number for God's people, equals 144,000. It represents all of God's people on the earth at a given time. It's not to be taken literally. Does it mean that there can never be less? There can't be 143,999. Does it mean there can't be 144,001? It's just representing all of God's people at all times. Finally, 3.5. It is half the perfect number. It means incompleteness. It is expressed in 3 different ways. Time, times, half a time. Time is 1, times, so 2, and half a time, 3.5. 42 months, 1,260 days. That's 3.5 years. It's the number for incompleteness. And so it is used to represent an incomplete amount of time. As an example, the Christians would suffer, and some of these examples of 42 months, 1,260 days are given, saying it's not going to last forever because it's not perfection. What we'll do on Wednesday, we've got to go through our outline and then our rules for studying, and then we'll get into chapter 1 on